All right, so I'm going to talk tonight about the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate, because we need one right now. And I'm going to ask the question, first of all, what is the doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate? What is this? And I'll just start by noting that there are various levels of government, as you know. So various levels of magistrate. And in a country like ours, there are different jurisdictions of power. Okay? So you have federal government, you have provincial government, you have municipal government. So there's three different levels of government: federal, provincial, municipal. And even then, you have separation within those powers. So there's separation between the police and the prosecutors and the courts. Okay, so they're each supposed to be, in an ideal world, separate. So theoretically, that should keep power from being too centralized in one place. Centralized power tends to be dangerous when you're dealing with government, and you don't want that. And so those who designed this system designed various levels of government and then various separations within government. Okay? The doctrine of the Lesser Magistrate is the teaching that lesser levels of government have the right and duty to resist and refuse higher levels of government when those higher levels of government impose unjust laws. So if a higher level of government imposes an unjust law, it is the duty of the lower level of government to resist it. And I think this is important to talk about right now, because it would be nice if a lower level of government would resist some of the things we're facing right now. So, for example, if the provincial government were to enact unjust laws, let's just say hypothetically they did. If the provincial government were to enact unjust laws, the municipalities would have the right and duty to resist and refuse enforcement. The duty of the municipal government becomes protecting its citizens from the injustice of the provincial government in such a case. So, but more often than not, and this is what we're seeing, the municipalities pass the buck and defer to the higher magistrate. I'll give you an example of this. Back in April, we as a church wrote a letter to various levels of government asking if they would work with us to reopen the church. So by April, we'd started to wisen up to what's going on. We were concerned. We thought it'd be safe to come back to church. And we offered to work with the government, various levels of government. So one of the local mayor replied back on April the 28th, after we sent a letter on April the 24th. This is about as substantive of a reply we received to our initial letter. Thank you for your thoughtful request. These are difficult times for leaders at all levels of government, and especially healthcare, as we balance social needs with the desire to maintain our healthcare system at a level that can attend to the needs of the most ill. As I'm sure you are aware, the closure of places of worship are a directive of the provincial government. And so we will wait for their and subsequently the region's guidance on the timing for return to in-person worship services. Hopefully your safety protocol will be helpful to all of us as we consider reopening the province. In the meantime, I trust your congregation is able to worship together apart. And I hope she has dinner at a vegetarian steakhouse. On a really dry, rainy day. In the meantime, I trust your congregation is able to worship together apart, sincerely. So my point is what she did in her reply is she deferred to the provincial government. Now, what she could have done is she could have advocated for her citizens, or she could have operated within the municipality or within the region to advocate for justice, even though the provincial government was imposing unjust edicts. So that's a cop-out. That's what that is. It's a cop-out. A lesser magistrate with honor, courage, and morality would not pass the buck. He would actively resist impositions upon his citizens because he loves them. That's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. So let me give you a few historical examples of how this has played out in the past. I'll offer two historical examples of when a lesser magistrate acted properly and courageously to protect their people from unjust higher magistrates. Unjust higher magistrates. We'll go all the way back to the year 1199 in England. At the death of Richard the Lionheart, his younger brother was crowned King John I in 1199. You remember King John from Robin Hood? He wasn't a good king. He was not half the military leader of his older brother or father, but he was egotistical and autocratic. He lost the nation's territory in Normandy after 150 years of union, only to lose the confidence of his people. King John I spent the remainder of his rule trying to recover and prove he was as good a conqueror as his predecessors. He tried to win back parts of France. He imposed royal government in Ireland. He forced the Scots to recognize him as an overlord. He terrorized the Welsh. And to finance his exploits, he levied a 13-part tax, or a 13th part tax on all income and movable property. So even movable property he could tax. In 1205, the Archbishop of Canterbury, or the Archbishopric of Canterbury, was vacated under King John I. And so what King John did, is the opportunist that he was, he refused to fill it because he wanted the church's money for himself instead of paying for a new bishop. And this was a tactic that he'd used in other parts of his realm. He would refuse to fill, I guess it was at his prerogative to appoint bishops in various parts of the realm, and he would refuse to fill bishoprics because he wanted the money for himself. This was going to be part of his means to conquer the world or prove himself to be a good king. The Roman Pontiff, so the Bishop of Rome, was exasperated by John, and he defied the king. He defied King John, and he himself appointed Archbishop Stephen Langton to become the Archbishop of Canterbury. So there's a conflict arising between church and state in England. The king doesn't want there to be a bishop in England, an archbishop in England, and the Church of Rome does, the Pope of Rome does. So there's the king and the church are now fighting. Who has supremacy over the church? That's the question. Well, John's trouble didn't start. The English people's distrust for him was already too deep. Incensed by another costly military defeat in France, the English barons revolted against his abusive taxation in 1215. So he was taxing them and taxing them and taxing them and taxing them to pay for all of these military projects that he wasn't really gaining anything out of. And the barons in England, so the wealthy leaders in England, teamed up with the church. And they received ecclesiastical support from the Archbishop of Canterbury, Stephen Langton, the same Langton from whom John had previously confiscated all church buildings and land. So one of the things that John did is he confiscated church buildings and land. He said, those are mine to use, not yours. And so he was fighting the church, and he levied the power of the state to forbid the church from using their own land. Okay? And on the 15th of June, 1215, the barons and the archbishop chased King John down and forced him to sign the Magna Carta at Runnymede, which is 5 miles west of the present-day Heathrow Airport. And what the Magna Carta did is it forced the king to recognize that he must operate under the rule of law. He is not the law, he is under the law. And it wasn't an invention of a new law. They were simply taking the ancient laws of England, and they were applying them to the situation. And he himself had abandoned the ancient laws of England, and they said, you as our king must uphold our laws. And he had to. Magna Carta marks a time in English history when the king himself learned that he must be subject to the law instead of the law being subject to the king. Highlights of Magna Carta include the right to due process, protection against unlawful search and seizure, freedom from taxation without representation, and most important in my mind, the complete freedom and autonomy of the English church. Magna Carta guaranteed the church complete freedom and autonomy. It was not the states to run. Now, the Pope later nullified Magna Carta at King John's request, but every subsequent English king who violated Magna Carta was considered in principle to be a tyrant, to the point that future English kings reinstituted editions of the Magna Carta multiple times to quell angry populations who were irate over government overreaches. So the government would overreach, and then what the people would get mad, and then what the kings would do to quell the people would be to reinstitute Magna Carta. Magna Carta took a lot of biblical principles and applied them to the law. Of course, it came 400 years after King Alfred. King Alfred had already codified English common law by taking the law of God in the Bible and applying it to civil law or common law. And these people found that King John had violated that code, and they forced him to adhere to it. So there's the first one, Magna Carta. We trace our liberty as English speakers back to Magna Carta and before that. All right? It's one of the most important documents in the English-speaking world as far as liberty goes. There's your first example historically. Here's the second one, the Magdeburg Confession. Magdeburg Confession. Moving forward 300 years. The year was 1517. And Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses to the church door at Wittenberg, which sparked the Protestant Reformation. The Reformation was ecclesiastical and political. So Luther came under the ire of the government and the church leaders. He made enemies on both fronts. Church leaders and government leaders. In 1521, at the order of Emperor Charles V, Luther was forced to defend his teaching at the Diet of Worms. At the Diet, Luther was called to recant of his beliefs. So the emperor calls him in to this inquiry, and then he is asked to give up, repent of his beliefs. Well, Luther refused. He famously said, "Here I stand, I can do no other, so help me God, amen." He refused in the face of the emperor. Emperor Charles V, at that, commanded that Luther be punished as a notorious heretic, which was essentially a death sentence. So Luther refuses to recant. The emperor demands that he's punished by death. And the emperor further ordered Luther's arrest and forbade anyone from this time forward to dare, either by words or deeds, to receive, defend, sustain, or favor the said Martin Luther. So anyone that would help Martin Luther was now a criminal in any way at all. By order and decree of the emperor, Charles V. Thankfully, Luther lived in a smaller jurisdiction under a lesser magistrate by the name of Prince Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony. He was a lesser magistrate under Emperor Charles V. And what Frederick the Wise did, is he resisted Charles. He faked a kidnapping of Luther to get him out of Charles's sight. So he had a bunch of guys show up, and everyone's plotting to get Luther. And Frederick the Wise fakes Luther's kidnapping and hides him and protected him from Charles. Had he not done so, one wonders what might have come of the Protestant Reformation. It could have been killed right there. So the Protestant Reformation was likely protected, preserved, and perpetuated by a lesser magistrate who resisted the tyranny of a higher magistrate, by Frederick the Wise, Prince Frederick the Wise, the Elector of Saxony, who resisted the decree of the Emperor Charles V. Fast forward 20 years later, 1548. Emperor Charles V made a law that attempted to put all Protestants under Roman Catholic rule. So all Protestants would be forced to abide by teachings and doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church. This is what Emperor Charles V attempted to do. Every city in Europe followed the orders, except one, Magdeburg. They protected the Reformation from centralized tyranny which attempted to squash it. And the pastors of Magdeburg published the Magdeburg Confession, which justified the city's defiance of the emperor. So the pastors of Magdeburg pulled together, and they published this confession, the Magdeburg Confession. And the Magdeburg Confession substantiated scripturally why the leaders of Magdeburg should resist the tyranny of the emperor and protect the Protestants in the city. The first to sign that document was Nicholas von Armsdorf, who was a close friend of Martin Luther's and who was present during the kidnapping of Martin Luther by Frederick the Wise, whereby he actually faked the kidnapping and rescued him 20 years later. Let me read from the Magdeburg Confession that the Protestant Lutheran pastors of Magdeburg published. The magistrate is an ordinance of God for the honor to good works and a terror to evil works. Romans 13. We all know that, right? Therefore, when he begins to be a terror to good works and honor to evil, there is no longer in him, because he does thus the ordinance of God, but the ordinance of the devil. And he who resists such works does not resist the ordinance of God, but the ordinance of the devil. And so what the Magdeburg Confession articulates is that resistance to tyranny is not resistance to God, but resistance to Satan. Obedience to tyranny, obedience to tyrants, is obedience to the devil. Because the tyrants are commanding you to do what God tells you not to do, or they're telling you not to do what God tells you to do. So the Magdeburg Confession tells us, makes a strong argument, that resistance to such works is not a resistance to God, but a resistance to Satan. And what's the Bible tell us, by the way? What's the book of James tell us? Draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. So you want to put an end to satanic tyranny? Resist it. And Satan will eventually have to give up. It might come with some pain on the resistors, but Satan will eventually give up. So the Magdeburg Confession refers to a state that stomps out worship, because they were trying to stomp out true worship. And they refer to a state that stomps out worship as the devil. And those who uphold said laws as devils. They are tools and instruments of the devil. And following such orders translates is, I did what the devil told me. Now, that's not a quote from the confession. I'm just articulating the sentiment of the confession. So you have a local magistrate who says, well, I'm just enforcing these laws. I'm just following orders. Well, you've done a very good job of obeying Satan. That's what you're doing. If you're being told to do that which is evil and you're just following orders, well, you have just obeyed the devil. Because it is the devil who enacts wicked laws. The Magdeburg Confession resisted Charles's tyranny. It goes on a little further. That was in 1548. Charles was eventually driven out of Germany into Italy. And then later, he granted religious freedom to the reformers at the Peace of Passau in 1552, which lasted into 1555, when the Peace of Augsburg formalized religious freedom for Protestants. Had it not been for this document, or at least its teaching, Emperor Charles V might have stomped out the Reformation in Europe, only to prolong the eclipse of the gospel for several more generations. So it was this document, the city of Magdeburg resisting this tyranny, with this document as its foundation, that perpetuated the Reformation. And so what you had was some local magistrates, one city, who said, we are going to resist the tyranny of a big empire, and by their heroic stance, the gospel was perpetuated. So there's your second example. The first was the Magna Carta. The second one was the Magdeburg Confession. You'll notice in both of these stances for liberty, it was the pastors that were at the forefront. Magna Carta was Archbishop Stephen Langdon. The Magdeburg Confession were the pastors of Magdeburg. Moving on a little later, speaking of Protestant reformers, I just want to make a brief comment about John Knox, who lived from 1514 to 1517, or 1572. John Knox was a Scotsman. He studied under Calvin in Geneva, and he brought the Reformation to Scotland. He led the early Presbyterian movement. Knox got a hold of the Magdeburg Confession. So he got it. And his ministry in Scotland, he came under the ire of William Maitland of Lethington, Secretary of State for Mary, Queen of Scots. So the Queen was mad at him, and he came under the ire of William Maitland of Lethington. Maitland thought Knox was wrong to push lesser magistrates to oppose the higher magistrates. So Knox was pushing the lesser magistrates, the lower level government, to oppose the higher level government. And Maitland accused Knox of being wrong. And so in a confrontation with the Secretary of State for Mary, Queen of Scots, John Knox handed him a copy of the Magdeburg Confession and said, to resist a tyrant is not to resist God, nor yet his ordinance. In 1558, John Knox wrote Appellation to the Nobles of Scotland. The Roman Catholic Church had condemned Knox and burned him in effigy. He called upon the nobles to protect the innocent and oppose tyrants, and he cited in his appellation over 70 passages of Scripture and insisted that lesser magistrates protect the innocent and oppose those who made unjust laws or decrees. So that was John Knox. So that's a few historical examples. But you're probably wondering, what does the Bible say? Which would be a really good question. What does the Bible say? So let's look at a few Bible verses. We will note that not all of these Bible verses are lesser magistrates. Some of them are, but not all of them. But what these Bible verses illustrate is the principle. All of them demonstrate the principle of a lesser magistrate. Each is a lesser power, a lower level power, resisting a higher power because the higher power is operating tyrannically. So you have a higher power who is demanding that a lower power do wicked things, and the lower power resists the higher power. And so when you call on a lesser magistrate to resist tyranny and protect the good, what you're calling him to do is to resist a higher power, because the higher power is operating tyrannically. And the lower power has the ability and the power to protect those under it. It serves as a buffer between the higher power and even lower powers. And so if you have power over people, your job, and someone above you is abusive in their power, your job is to be a buffer between the abusive one and the ones under you. Okay? In the Magdeburg Confession, there was actually an example that used an illustration of something to the effect of, as I was reading it, it was something to the effect of if a father, it was pretty strong, if a father was to prostitute his wife and his daughters, he is the authority of his home, but it would be upon his wife and daughters to attempt to resist him, even though he is the authority of the home. And so they use that and they apply it to the government. Just because someone is an authority doesn't mean they have absolute authority. There's limits to it. And when an authority calls a lesser authority to do something evil, it is upon the lesser authority to resist the higher authority. Right? So let's look at the first example here of a lesser authority resisting a higher authority. Exodus chapter 1. This is probably one of the most famous ones. And what we're going to notice for each one of these is that the lesser authority resists the higher authority on the basis of the law of God, on the commandment of God. That's always the basis. So Exodus 1, verse 15 through 20. Then the king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah, when you serve as midwife to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it is a son, you shall kill him, but if it is a daughter, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but let the male children live. So what do? They resist. They resist the higher power. They refuse to say, I'm just following orders. Okay? They were heroic in their efforts. Verse 18, so the king of Egypt called the midwives and said to him, why have you done this and let the male children live? The midwives were very smart. Verse 19, they said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them. So it was a little bit of a... If you were playing hockey, you would say they faked the shot. Right? They faked the shot. And what does God do for them in verse 20? So God dealt well with the midwives. He dealt well with them. He blessed them because they resisted the higher power. Having a higher power tell a lower power to do something is no excuse for the lower power to do it. The lower power must obey God over man. So a lower magistrate must, or a lesser magistrate must obey God before he obeys a higher magistrate. But let's look at another one. This one's interesting. This one's fairly famous, but I'm going to point something out in it that you may not have noticed before, and that would be Daniel 3. Daniel 3. So King Nebuchadnezzar established an unjust law commanding all the people to worship an image in Daniel 3, verses 1 through 7. I'll read it. King Nebuchadnezzar made an image of gold whose height was 60 cubits and its breadth 6 cubits. He set it up in the plain of Dura in the province of Babylon. Then King Nebuchadnezzar sent to gather the satraps, the prefects and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, all the officials of the provinces to come to the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Then the satraps, the prefects, and the governors, the counselors, the treasurers, the justices, the magistrates, and all the officials of the provinces gathered for the dedication of the image that King Nebuchadnezzar had set up, and they stood before the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. And the herald proclaimed aloud, "You are commanded, O peoples, nations, and languages, that when you hear the sound of the hornpipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, you are to fall down and worship the golden image that King Nebuchadnezzar has set up. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall immediately be cast into a burning fiery furnace." Therefore, as soon as all the people heard the sound of the horn, the pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music, all the peoples, nations, and languages fell down and worshiped the image that Nebuchadnezzar had set up. Okay, so there was a commandment that went out to worship an image. If they didn't worship the image, they're going to be thrown into a fiery furnace, and they're going to be killed. Well, there was a group of people who refused to worship the image, and that was the Jews. Okay? Therefore, at the time, verse 8, therefore at that time, certain Chaldeans came forward and maliciously accused the Jews. Okay? They wouldn't worship this image. They call for action against 3 Jews specifically who refused to worship. So, verse 9. They declared to King Nebuchadnezzar, "O king, live forever. You, O king, have made a decree that every man who hears the sound of the horn, pipe, lyre, trigon, harp, bagpipe, and every kind of music shall fall down and worship the golden image. And whoever does not fall down and worship shall be cast in the burning fiery furnace. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. These men, O king, pay no attention to you. They do not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So, verse 8, they're viciously mad at the Jews. Verse 8 through 12, they accuse these 3 Jews of not worshiping the image, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But I want you to notice the Jews that are named. We just named them, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. What were they? They were magistrates. They were in government. They had positions of power within government. It says as much in verse 12. There are certain Jews whom you have appointed over the affairs of the province of Babylon. So these were government officials, lower magistrates, who became targets of the higher magistrate because they refused the king's order. And on what basis did they refuse the king's order? Well, verse 16 tells us why they refused it. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego answered and said to the king, "O Nebuchadnezzar, we have no need to answer you in this matter." You hear what they say? They say, "We don't even need to answer you. We don't even need to answer you. You are our king," but they call him king, "but we don't need to answer you. This isn't your business. If this be so, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace, and he will deliver us out of your hand, O king. But if not, be it known to you, O king, that we will not serve your gods or worship the golden image that you have set up." So they are thrown into the fiery furnace, as you know, and God rescued them. They didn't get burned at all in the fiery furnace, and they were rescued out of the fiery furnace. But the point I'm trying to make is that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were lesser magistrates who resisted the order of a higher magistrate. And when a higher magistrate commands a lower magistrate to disobey God, they obey God over man. And again, what I want to point out, just as I did in the case of the Hebrew midwives, is in this case, the lesser magistrates, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, saw that the king was ordering them to violate the commandments of God. The first 2 commandments. The Hebrew midwives saw that the Pharaoh was ordering them to violate the commandments of God, which was the 6th commandment. Do not murder. But do you see the basis of their resistance? The basis of their resistance in both instances is the unchanging commandments of God written in stone. They do not change at the whims of men. I'll give you one more example from Daniel. This is a famous one. And then I'm going to move to a more obscure example after this. But Daniel 6 is another one. The leaders of Darius' kingdom call him to establish an unjust law. Daniel 6, verses 6 through 9. And these presidents and satraps came by agreement to the king and said to him, O King Darius, live forever. All the presidents of the kingdom, the prefects and the satraps, the counselors and the governors are agreed that the king should establish an ordinance and enforce an injunction that whoever makes petition to any god or man for 30 days except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions. Now, O king, establish the injunction and sign the document so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. Therefore, King Darius signed the document and the injunction. So there's an unjust law that's brought into place, and the law is saying that nobody can pray except to King Darius. So he's forbidding worship, public worship and prayer. Within the king's court, there were 3 presidents, and Daniel was one of them. Daniel was a lesser magistrate. Within the king's court. So if you look at verse 1 and 2, it pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps to be throughout the whole kingdom, and over them 3 presidents, of whom Daniel was one, to whom these satraps should give account so that the king might suffer no loss. So there were 120 satraps in the kingdom, and there were 3 presidents over those satraps. The 3 presidents answered to King Darius, and then the 120 satraps answered to the 3 presidents. So the 3 presidents were a magistrate between the king and the satraps. Daniel was the highest of the presidents. Verse 3. Then this Daniel became distinguished above all the other presidents and satraps because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So next to the king was Daniel. He was a lesser magistrate under the king. And as a lesser magistrate, second to the king, Daniel openly defied the king's decree and the king's injunction. He didn't defy it quietly. He defied it in a way that was in your face. Verse 10. When Daniel knew that the document had been signed, he went to his house where he had windows in his upper chamber open toward Jerusalem. He got on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God as he had done previously. Then these men came by agreement and found Daniel making petition and plea to God. They came near and said before the king, concerning the injunction, O king, did you not sign an injunction that anyone who makes petition to any god or man within 30 days except to you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? The king answered and said, the thing stands fast according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be revoked. So, what happened was Darius decreed that all the people within his realm violate the first 2 commandments. He wanted to order their worship. He saw it as his prerogative to order the worship of the people. And just for 30 days, just 30 days, Daniel could have shut up. But Daniel immediately goes to an open window, and he prays openly and publicly, is the highest magistrate in the realm, in defiance of the king. What do you think that would have done to the common Jew in the realm? Like, think about this. Daniel is a Jew. He's pretty well next to the king. All the Jews are terrified. You have all these Jews they'd be at the bottom of the pecking order, but one has risen to power. And the one that rose to power sees all the other ones, and in an act of open defiance, emboldens every single one of them, and he takes the brunt of it. When the higher magistrate commands a lower magistrate to obey the commandments of God, it is the lower magistrate's duty to refuse it, which doesn't just protect the people under him, but emboldens them to defy the tyranny. That's Daniel 3. So what's a common thread, or Daniel 6? What's the common thread throughout these 3 stories? The Hebrew midwives, Nebuchadnezzar's idolatry, Darius's act of blasphemy, all 3 of them. What is the key to resistance? The the unchanging law of God becomes the ground of resistance. So I got another one that's more obscure. 1 Samuel 14. 1 Samuel 14. 24 through 46. I'm not going to read the whole thing. 1 Samuel 14. King Saul makes a very rash vow in the middle of a fight. There's a battle going on, and he makes a rash vow. In verse 24. The rash vow, he says, and the men of Israel had been hard pressed that day. So Saul had laid an oath on the people, saying, cursed be the man who eats food until it is evening, and I am avenged of my enemies. So none of the people had tasted food. So this is an absolutely stupid thing to do. They're engaged in armed conflict. And Saul is like, we're going to beat our enemies, and you're not getting any food until you win, until it's over. Well, these guys are physically exerting themselves in armed combat all day, and so they're absolutely famished. It says he laid an oath. Now, interestingly, this is a little bit of a hint into the text. In verse 24, it says he laid an oath, where the verb for laid an oath is a word play on a Hebrew verb. And related to this verb, laid an oath, is a verb that means play the fool. So if you're reading this text, you're reading two things into it. Number one, Saul made a very stupid oath, and one of the reasons I know that it's a very stupid oath is because the verb is related to another verb that translates as play the fool. So that's embedded in there. Saul was a fool. Well, his son Jonathan didn't hear about this vow. And his son Jonathan was a valiant fighter. He had the respect of the people, and unlike Saul, who didn't. And what his son Jonathan does is he eats honey. Verse 25. Now, when all the people came to the forest, behold, there was honey on the ground. And when the people entered the forest, behold, the honey was dropping, but no one put his hand to his mouth, for the people feared the oath. Saul made the oath. But they're hungry, right? Like they're wasting away in battle. Like, could you imagine physically exerting yourself all day and not eating? But Jonathan, verse 27, had not heard his father's charge, the people with the oath. So he put the tip of the staff that was in his hand and dipped it in the honeycomb and put his hand in his mouth, or to his mouth, and his eyes became bright. Why did his eyes become bright? Well, his blood sugar level shot up. Right? He got some calories into him after he'd been fighting all day. Verse 30, how much better if the people had eaten freely today, if the spoil of their enemies that they found. For now the defeat among the Philistines has not been great. So Jonathan actually complains. He's like, why aren't you guys eating? You're not fighting as well. Well, he didn't really know what was going on. Later on, Saul makes an inquiry of the Lord because he thinks there's sin in the camp. But he receives no answer from God. Or he receives no answer from God, so he thinks there's sin in the camp. So we go down to verse 38, or verse 37. And Saul inquired of God, shall I go down after the Philistines? Will you give them into the hand of Israel? But he did not answer him that day. So God is silent towards Saul, and so Saul all of a sudden assumes that there's sin in the camp. So Saul's thinking, who sinned? Who ate the food? Who ate the honey? So he assumes there's sin, and makes an inquiry of the people in verse 38. And Saul said, come here, all you leaders of the people. Now keep in mind, Saul's the king. And know and see how this sin has arisen today. For as the Lord lives, who saves Israel, though it be in Jonathan my son, he shall surely die. The irony, right? He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't have a clue. I am so just, I will even kill my son, right? But there was not among all the people who answered him. They wouldn't answer him. Why didn't they answer him? They all knew who ate it. Because they loved Jonathan. And they knew this was unjust. They knew the king had acted foolishly. He had overreached as king, so the people would not answer him. But they all knew it was Jonathan. They all knew. Well, eventually Jonathan admits that he ate the honey. Verse 40. Then he said to all Israel, you shall be on one side, and I and Jonathan my son shall be on the other. And the people said to Saul, do what seems good to you. Verse 41, therefore Saul said, O Lord God of Israel, why have you not answered your servant this day? If this guilt is in me or in Jonathan my son, O Lord God of Israel, give Urim. But if this guilt is in your people, give Thummim. And that was just like casting lots almost. And Jonathan and Saul were taken, but the people escaped. Then Saul said, cast the lot between me and my son Jonathan. And Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, tell me what you have done. And Jonathan told him, I tasted a little honey with the tip of the staff that was in my hand. Here I am, I will die. And Saul said, God do so to me or more also. You shall surely die, Jonathan. So he's going to kill Jonathan. Jonathan ate honey. What a foolish, foolish king this was. What an absolutely foolish king. But watch what the people do. People interpose. And they resist the higher magistrate. Why? Because the higher magistrate is about to violate the sixth commandment. Verse 44. Then the people said to Saul, shall Jonathan die, who has worked this great salvation in Israel? Far from it. As the Lord lives, there shall not one hair of his head fall to the ground, for he has worked with God this day. So the people ransomed Jonathan so that he did not die. So the people all of a sudden rejected Saul's rule because they saw that Saul's rule was unjust. And one of the things that you learn about as you read the Bible and as you look at history is the governed cannot govern unless the governed consent to it. Unless the governed consent, they cannot be governed. And these governed did not want to consent to the violation of the sixth commandment. They did not want to consent to it. They refused. And so by refusing to consent to murder, they protected Jonathan's life. And he was rescued. So it was a big group of them. All right, one more. One more. This one might be a little more familiar too. But it's in Matthew. And in Matthew 2, verse 7 through 9. Then Herod summoned the wise men, so chapter 2, verse 7, secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. So Herod says, go find the child and then come tell me. Come back and tell me where the child was, or is, because Herod has evil intent, right? And in verse 13, we move up, or verse 12 rather. And being warned in a dream after they visited Jesus, not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose and took the child and his mother by night and departed to Egypt and remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children at Bethlehem. So what did the wise men do? They disobeyed Herod. God told them to in a dream. And they didn't just disobey him, they tricked him. They humiliated him. The word could also be translated, I think, deceived him. Why did they do that? Because they were operating between Herod and Jesus, and they were protecting Jesus from the wrath of Herod. They were interposing. So each one of these stories, so I've listed 1, 2, 3, 4 biblical examples. No, 5. 5 biblical examples. And in each one of those examples, you have a lesser power resisting the decrees of the higher power to operate as a buffer to protect the lower power from tyranny. And in each one, the higher power is in violation of God's unchanging law. The lesser power recognizes it and therefore defies the tyrant. Defies the tyrant. We have a number of lesser powers resisting higher powers because the higher powers were abusive. Every one of them. And so here's what you will note. In all of these instances, the lesser power, our lesser magistrate, were justified in their disobedience of a higher magistrate because of an objective, immovable, transcendent, unchanging law. They were justified in their resistance because of an objective, immovable, unchanging law. The higher magistrate called for injustice, and the lower power resisted because he knew what the law was, and he was able to recognize the higher magistrate as unjust. God's law is the objective standard, and without it, the magistrate operates on a whim. But the only way they were able to justify their resistance is because they were able to recognize that the higher magistrate was in violation of God's law. That's the only way. Now, there's a powerful line in the Ten Commandments movie. You ever seen the Ten Commandments movie with Charlton Heston? Playing Moses, right? And he said to Pharaoh, "Man shall be ruled by law, not by the will of other men." When a nation is ruled by men, it is slavery and tyranny. When a nation is ruled by law, it is free. But that law, in order for men to be free, must be God's law. So what the problem is today is that we've abandoned the law of God, and therefore the rule of law is conflated with the will of men. We have men in power who issue edicts that infringe upon our worship, and thus calling us to violate the first, second, and fourth commandments. They infringe upon our work, thus calling us to violate the fourth commandment. And in doing so, they themselves violate the eighth commandment. Which is why, by the way, I reacted so strongly to the first lockdown. One of the reasons is because I immediately recognized the government's infringement upon free enterprise is a violation of the eighth commandment. Do not steal. It wasn't their property to shut down. It's theft. To take another man's property and rob him of his livelihood. It's theft. Even the Magna Carta talks about this. If the government is going to use an individual's property in order to protect the nation in war, it must compensate. It must compensate the one whose property it has taken. I think it actually says fully that the worth of it. Well, you have businesses going out of business all over the place. Our government can't afford to compensate them. They can't afford to. So it's a violation of the eighth commandment. Even all the public health charges are violations of the ninth commandment. They're violations of the ninth commandment. Why? Because they are insisting that by worshiping God and opening businesses, people are endangering the lives of others, which is whipped up hysteria. The ninth commandment is, "Thou shalt not bear false witness." You're going around saying, you people are guilty of killing people because you want to worship. You're endangering lives. It's criminal negligence, basically. We're governed by the whims of men, and they call it the rule of law, but it is the whims of men because nobody knows what the rule of law is. Now, I think one of the lowest level magistrates are police officers. And they themselves are bound by oath to uphold the highest law, which is the Constitution, Charter. And it is their duty to do so, to resist unjust orders. Otherwise, they become like King John's Sheriff of Nottingham. They're complicit in it. But again, in order to discern an unjust order, one must know the law of God. That's the only way. You must know it. Otherwise, you don't know what an unjust order is. You can't recognize it. You can't see it for what you don't know. You don't know that theft is wrong. You don't know that a man is entitled to his own property. Then you won't be able to recognize it as wrong when the government takes his property. See, you guys, you heard about these people in parts of Ontario where they're telling parents to quarantine their kids for 14 days. Did you hear about that? So they put they're being told the kids test positive for COVID at school, and then the government, the health workers tell them to put their kids in a room and not talk to their kids for 14 days and leave the food outside the door. And parents were doing it, doing their part. There's people that have tested positive for COVID, and they'll say, well, when was the last time you were intimate with your wife? That's none of your business. You know? That's none of their business. But what these people are doing is they're subverting a natural order of things that God has put in place. This is God's order. And they're subverting it, but you cannot recognize it unless you understand the law of God. And a lesser magistrate will not be able to recognize the abuses of a higher magistrate unless he understands the law of God. So it was a satanic ploy to erase our knowledge of the law of God in this nation. That's satanic. Now, there's some good things that are happening. The Liberty Coalition of Canada, which you might have been following, has established an anti-lockdown caucus of dissenting politicians. There's at least a couple dozen of them, I think, now. At least a couple dozen. And so they include municipal councillors, mayors, MPs, MPPs, and that's really good. But what we need, really, is a municipality to rise up and reject it and uphold the doctrine of the lesser magistrate. That's why I'm teaching this. I hope maybe someone will catch wind of it and go with it. Because there are politicians that are concerned and they're against what's going on, but I'm not too sure if they know what they do. But they have scriptural grounds to resist if they have the power to do so. And so what we need is municipalities to rise up and reject it. We actually need a city with mayors and councillors who will declare that they actually exist to protect their people. They will use the power of that municipality to protect them, and not use the power of the municipality to impose unjust laws on their citizens. Regardless of what the federal or provincial governments tell them to do, they need to uphold the rule of law and not conflate the rule of law with the whims of men. It was interesting, I noticed very early on that various cities in Northern California actually did this. It was very scriptural. A number of states are doing it, but no one's doing it in this country yet. But I hope they will. I hope they will. So that's the doctrine of the lesser magistrate.